Okay, good day, everybody. I'm here to talk about the era of good feelings. This is the era that comes after, um, I guess it's signaled by the death of the Federalist Party. This is where there is only essentially one party in the United States, and that is the Democratic Republican Party. Eventually, the Whig Party would form in opposition to the Democratic Republican Party, and the Democratic Republican Party would turn into the Democratic Party. That was kind of the party of Andrew Jackson. But first, that era of where there's only one party is known as the era of good feelings. And that would be during the presidency of James Monroe, who was the last of the Virginia dynasty presidents. He fought in the American Revolution. He served under the Jefferson administration. I'm pretty sure he served under the Madison administration. When there's no real political opposition and the Federalists fell apart, this is referred to as the era of good feelings. However, it wasn't the era of good feelings for everyone, because bubbling under the surface there was economic crisis. There was that huge issue that would lead the United States to civil war, which involved expanding the country, moving west, and slavery. What to do with new states? Would they become slave or free states? Would slavery be allowed in the new states? And then the Supreme Court would become more powerful. It would, essentially, I think still to this day, it is the most powerful branch. I'm going to describe the era of good feelings in six concepts. First of all, the concept number one was the power that the Supreme Court took. And this is not a constitutional principle, but Marbury versus Madison set the precedent that the Supreme Court would have the final say over the law. And that final say is called judicial review. So essentially, if a state passes a law and somebody challenges that law, it is up to federal courts, kind of the last stage would be the Supreme Court, to decide whether or not that law is constitutional. And if it is, the law is upheld. If it's not, the Supreme Court strikes it down. And there are many examples of important Supreme Court cases in American history and how those Supreme Court cases have changed society. But the first case that involved, that set the precedent, I should say, of judicial review was Marbury versus Madison in 1803, in which John Adams hired many Federalist judges right before he left office. These were referred to as the midnight appointments. Jefferson did not give them jobs when he took office. So when he took office, it was like, Jefferson took office. He was like, well, we're not going to hire these people. William Marbury, who was in one of these positions, sued because he did not get his job. So Marbury sued Jefferson's Secretary of State, who was James Madison, and the courts essentially ruled, I should say the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Thomas Jefferson, basically ruling that Jefferson had the power as President of the United States to decide who went where regarding federal appointments. Regardless of what this case was and what this case meant to Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or who got what job or even William Marbury, the main effect of this particular case was judicial review. And judicial review, again, is the concept, and this started in 1803 with Marbury v. Madison, the concept that the Supreme Court would have the final say over the law. And that exists to this day, even though that power is not vested in the Constitution. So that's one important point there. It actually happened before the era of good feelings, but it kind of, started to become more apparent and more influential as time went on. Concept two would be the Monroe Doctrine involving foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine, of course, issued by James Monroe, stated that all European countries, all outside influences, must stay out of the Americas. They can't establish colonies in North or South America. And if they do, it would be declaration of war against the United States. So if Spain, for example, wanted to establish a new colony in South America, well, they already had colonies, but if France wanted to establish a new colony in Mexico or anywhere in the Americas, it would be an attack on the United States. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine stated that if anybody was going to mess with any of these areas in North or South America, it was going to be the United States. Okay, so this was sort of an exercise of American power, the Monroe Doctrine. The third concept was the death of the Federalist Party, culminating in the Hartford Convention, in which people started to lose favor. The Federalist Party started to lose favor with the American people. During the Hartford Convention, they proposed all sorts of different changes to the Constitution. They proposed that, that they might secede from the Union, like the New England states might secede from the Union if war was declared in the War of 1812. As a result of the Hartford Convention and these radical changes to the Constitution, interfering with things like freedom of speech, kind of taking on what John Adams, I should say, what he started with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and threatening secession, people considered them to be traitors to the country. And you got to understand, with the War of 1812, the War of 1812 was all about, okay, I think the war hawks in the Democratic Republican Party were more influential than people who wanted peace. I mean, you had people who saw what the British were doing as clear violations of American sovereignty. And so the people who wanted peace with Great Britain heading into the War of 1812 lost out. And again, it was the Federalists, and the Federalists were considering such rash action that they were actually considered traitors. The other thing that led to the downfall of the Federalist Party was the duel that killed Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was involved with a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr at the time. This was Jefferson's vice president. It was over some drama, over Hamilton saying something that was repeated in a newspaper, and Aaron Burr taking an offense to that and demanding an apology, and Alexander Hamilton not really apologizing. So oftentimes the way they settled disagreements like this was through a duel in which each individual would have a gun, and they would step off 12 paces or 10 paces or whatever it was in opposite directions. They would turn around, and the first person to shoot and hit the other person would win the duel. Most of the time, if you showed up for a duel, this was sort of to protect your honor, and if you showed up, it was good enough. You didn't really have to kill the other person. Oftentimes, people would walk in different directions, turn around and fire in the air, and that was good enough. It was like, okay, I was willing to take on this challenge, and therefore the conflict was ended. Unfortunately for Hamilton, he turned around, missed on purpose. Burr turned around. He had 4 seconds to shoot. He fired, hit Alexander Hamilton in the side, went through his liver, damaging a vital organ, and lodged in his spine. He died a day later. So Hamilton's death was another signal. Well, I mean, he was sort of the head of the Federalist Party, and he might have become President of the United States had he lived. But without Hamilton, the Federalist Party lost a key voice, and that was another, combined with the Hartford Convention and how angry that made people, that was kind of the death knell of the Federalist Party. Another issue that was so important was, the Missouri Compromise, which is the first step. Well, I'm not going to say the first step, but in the 19th century, it's certainly the first step on the way to civil war. As a result of the Louisiana Purchase, there were 2 states that came into the Union. I'm going to move my head so you can see the map here. One state that came into the Union was Missouri, and the idea was, okay, what are we going to do with Missouri? Are we going to make it a free or slave state? Of course, people against slavery wanted to make it a free state. People for slavery wanted to make it a slave state. And keep in mind, if you enter a new state into the Union, let's say it's a slave state, that means more people for slavery are going to be in the U.S. Congress. Same thing if it becomes a free state. That means more free staters are going to be members of the U.S. Congress. So slave staters would become more powerful if Missouri becomes a slave state. So there's this conflict between Missouri and, well, I'm sorry, free staters and slave staters. People for slavery, people against slavery. The solution was to draw a line across the country and state, okay, all the states, all the new states coming in south of the line would become slave states. All the states coming in to the Union above the line would become free states, north of the line. We'll make Missouri a slave state. The red states denote slave state status. And we will carve Maine out of Massachusetts, because Maine technically was a part of Massachusetts at the time. We'll make it a free state to balance the free states and the slave states. That's kind of how they reached this compromise. This was known as the Missouri Compromise, 1820. So this is right during the era of good feelings, and this was a signal that, you know, I don't know, this was the first step, really, if you ask me, towards civil war. That's not the first step, but it's one of the main steps. The Adams-Onis Treaty, this was signed in 1819. Spain agreed to give Florida to the United States and give up its claims to Oregon, and the United States agreed to pay off $5 million in debt to Spain, which it was in debt to. So again, America, or the United States, expands even more so than they did with the Louisiana Purchase. They add Florida, and they have access, technically, to Oregon, even though the British would factor into a claim on Oregon as well. But the Adams-Onis Treaty is significant in the fact that the United States continues to grow by leaps and bounds. And then finally, something that we're going to definitely deal with in class, another step to the Civil War, was the proliferation of the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney. At least he gets the credit for it. I do believe that it was sort of invented before that, but Eli Whitney received the patent. This was a machine that separated the seeds from the cotton, so therefore the slaves did not have to hand pick the seeds out of the cotton. You had a machine doing it for you. This would actually, and we're going to watch a video about this, but this would actually lead to more slavery in the southern states. Because, you know, before that, most of the slaves, their time would be spent picking the seeds out of the cotton. Now, since you have a brand new machine doing that for you, the slaves could be utilized to plant more cotton and harvest more cotton. And therefore, the production of cotton went up. And therefore, more cotton was grown. And therefore, the demand for more slaves went up as well. So this is an example of a new technology that that you would think, well, you know, the slaves, all of a sudden you've got a machine doing something that the slaves were doing, but in fact, this led to more slavery. Way more slavery. Some people thought without the cotton gin that slavery would die out, and because the cotton gin, because this caused cotton to explode in the South, that a demand for more slaves, went up. So anyway, these are main themes from the era of good feelings. Some of them occurred in the era of good feelings, keep in mind, from 1817 to 1825. Some of them, occurred before the era of good feelings, like Marbury versus Madison, but would affect the era of good feelings and everything that came after it. So, anywho, be ready for your quiz on this. 6 main concepts there. And I, of course, will catch you cats on the flip flop. Have a great day.